Hey y'all, welcome back. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bonnethead and I do horror analysis on the internet. We're gonna have a little bit of conspiracy fun today. Well, how does that sound? I know it sounds pretty good to me, so let's get into it. Now, this channel is no stranger to conspiracies that don't necessarily feel like conspiracies. And at that, movies that don't really feel like they're just movies. A lot of the stuff we cover here definitely feels like it's trying to say something else or expose someone or something. And in saying that, we are also not totally unfamiliar with the film industry's not so subtle attempts at revealing the truth via stories or via art, via film, specifically via horror. And I don't think there's any mistake in the genre's focus or hyperfixation on that. Now, we talked about a lot of this in our analysis of the Purge universe. If you haven't seen that video, it'll be linked down below. But in that video, we discovered that our universe isn't too far from the one that allows crime to be legal for 12 hours one day a year. We've also covered some of these very same concepts in our video about Sorry to Bother You, which covers the idea that corporate America wants nothing more than for you to be a slave to capital interest or a literal workhorse, because that's how they profit. We even talked about They Cloned Tyrone recently, which talks about the very real and very manufactured predictability of our population. So like I said, horror is no stranger to some sort of political or social commentary where they're trying to say more with what is depicted in the film. Sort of like an artistic expose of sorts. But what happens when these horror movie conspiracies start to bleed into real life? What happens when a director goes too far and actually start to become their own conspiracy? That is the question that we're going to be answering in today's episode of Scary News. I love talking horror movies, I love talking politics, and I love talking conspiratorially, so let's get into it. I'm sure many of you have seen or at least heard of the film Eyes Wide Shut. And if you haven't heard of it, then you most definitely know the name of the director, who is the man of the hour, Stanley Kubrick. If that name still doesn't sound familiar, then maybe his other films will. The Shining should jog your memory just in and of itself. But we also have Full Metal Jacket, we have A Clockwork Orange, we have Lolita, etc., etc., etc. He is a big name in film, specifically in horror. He's also the man behind 2001: A Space Odyssey, so we see that he's definitely no stranger to creating films that have political commentary in them. But the film that we're talking about today, his very last ever film, Eyes Wide Shut, is one of his more poorly performing films. A lot of people didn't like it when it first came out. A lot of people thought it was weird. They didn't understand the messaging. It was just kind of a flop. But now there seems to be a new understanding of it, and there's sort of a revitalization of the interest in this topic with the release of the Epstein files, the partial release anyways, which is also why we are going to be covering this film today. Now, for those of you who don't know, this film came out July 16th, 1999. That date is important. Remember it. It stars Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, who play a married couple in the film, who are struggling to connect with each other intimately, to say the least. Nicole Kidman's character expresses to Tom Cruise that she has fantasies and often fantasizes about being with other men. She wants to cheat. And as a result, Tom Cruise's character becomes very, very insecure, as I'm sure many people would. And he becomes obsessed with trying to step outside of the marriage himself, even though Nicole Kidman's character hasn't technically stepped outside of the marriage. She's just fantasized about it. But in any case, Tom Cruise's character in this venture to try and step outside of the marriage stumbles across a sex cult filled with all of the New York City's most powerful people. And the movie just sort of unfolds from there. It's a very, very interesting watch. I highly recommend it, especially if you haven't already. Even if you have already, I would recommend a rewatch, just knowing all of the stuff about the Epstein files. The movie has so much to say. It has endless points to analyze, but I actually think it's a better movie for my co-host and I to analyze over on the Jinx Podcast, which is why we're not going to be analyzing the movie itself in depth here. So if you're actually wanting to see an in-depth analysis of the actual film, then go head on over to the Jinx Podcast and give us a little subscribe. That'll be coming soon. So in saying that, today, with this knowledge of the Epstein files in mind, we are going to be discussing the lesser known conspiracy theories and the lesser known controversies surrounding the creation of the movie and why Eyes Wide Shut might be a lot more real than you initially thought. So let's get some background, right? First things first, we have to know what happened. Now strap in and pay attention, because we are going through an entire timeline of events that ended up leading to Stanley Kubrick's seemingly suspiciously timely demise, and the reasons why this may have been his very last film. So let's go all the way back to the beginning in 1926. This is when Traum Novelle was published, a novella that was actually written by a man named Arthur Schnitzler. Now this novella very heavily inspired Eyes Wide Shut. It follows a married couple who actually jointly admit to each other that they fantasize about being with other people. Again, They want to cheat on each other. But again, after stumbling across a anonymous and very weird sex cult, the husband is very much traumatized, as I think any of us would be. And the couple is left the next day to rediscover their intimacy, rediscover each other, come back together as a couple instead of fantasizing about cheating. So obviously, lots of elements of this story very closely mimic Eyes Wide Shut. But Kubrick seemed to take the story about 3 steps further. If you watch the movie, you know what I mean. There's not really this idea of coming back together as a couple. There isn't even this idea of both parties fantasizing about sleeping with other people. Tom Cruise's character admits to never having had those thoughts at all. It is only when he finds out that Nicole Kidman's character has had those thoughts that he then wants to partake in cheating, because he feels emasculated. He feels like there was some sort of sexual power taken from him, so he wants to take it back. The film very heavily surrounds the idea of sexual power, and we're not going to get super into that, but we'll talk about it a little bit later. So that was 1926. Flash forward to 1990. This is when Kubrick gets the idea to turn Schnitzler's novella into a film with modern characters, a modern setting, and modern politics, all in the heart of NYC, New York. So after toying around with this idea for a little bit, we get to 1994. This is when Kubrick brings in a co-writer to aid in his adaptation of Tram Novelle into a film. And this is really when the writing process begins. This is when things just start to pick up. So after about 4 years of developing the idea and 2 years of writing it out, we finally get to the production of the film in November of 1996. Now, this is also not well known, but Eyes Wide Shut actually holds the Guinness World Record for the longest continuous film shooting, sitting at 400 days or 15 months. Now keep in mind, the actors were only contracted for 6 months of shooting, but they ended up staying and finishing out the movie for 15. A lot of this was due to reshoots, obviously. We're talking about a Stanley Kubrick movie here, who, if you don't know, has a sort of penchant for forcing actors to record 70 to upwards of 100 takes just to get one scene. It's actually what led to a lot of Shelley Duvall's mental health problems and her stepping away from film, was her experience in The Shining, or her experience acting in The Shining during its development, during production. So yeah, Stanley Kubrick did not change any of that behavior when Eyes Wide Shut was being produced. So cut to June of 1998, the film's production process starts to wrap up and then editing begins. Editing takes about a year, maybe a little over a year, which brings us to March 2nd, 1999. This is when Stanley Kubrick presented his final cut of the film to executives at Warner Bros. As well as to Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise. And he's presenting this final cut in New York City. And then 3 days later, on March 5th, 1999, he does the very same thing. He presents his second screening of the final cut of the film to, again, more Warner execs, but also to his family and his close friends at Childwickberry. And throughout all of this, Kubrick was really having to fight to keep the R rating on his movie instead of the NC-17 rating. He was fighting with Warner Bros. Execs. He was fighting with lower production people to make sure the film did not get an NC-17 rating. He wanted the R rating. But just 2 days later and 4 days after his first initial screening of his final cut, Stanley Kubrick dies at 70 years old of a heart attack in his sleep, despite having no previous health problems throughout the entirety of the film's production. Weird, right? Now, just as a reminder, March 2nd, 1999 is when he first screened his cut, his final cut, to Warner Bros. Executives. March 5th is his second screening of this final cut to even more Warner Bros. Executives, and then March 7th is when he dies. All after working on this movie about powerful sex cults in New York City for 10 years. Already we're looking a little bit suspicious. Now, remember the date I said earlier, July 16th, 1999. That was when Eyes Wide Shut was officially released to the public in the US. But coincidentally enough, it was also the exact same day that 2 Warner Bros. Chairmen resigned. Robert A. Daly and Terry Semel announced their resignations from their positions at Warner Bros., claiming to want to pursue an entrepreneurial or an independent path. Interesting that that would happen on the exact same day as the release of Eyes Wide Shut, which happened not too long after the death of Mr. Kubrick. All I'm saying is, I've got questions. Okay, hey, Milkshake and I are back again. So while I was editing this, I was doing a little bit more research and I found out another very, very interesting thing. And I would be remiss if I didn't include it here. So supposedly, in between when Kubrick presented his final cut of the movie and when it was released, it was recut after he died. And Warner Bros. Now refuses to release any of the footage that they cut from the initial film. And supposedly this additional footage expands upon the existence of these secret societies and cults. It looks into the details of actual existing cults, but Warner Bros. Completely denies that any of this had ever happened. So yeah, there's a little bit of extra info for you to convince you one way or the other. Anyways, back to me. Now, I do understand that this series of events does not seem too far-fetched. It could be pure coincidence that all of the events just so happen to line up. I fully understand that. Occam's razor, right? But once again, in light of the Epstein files and seeing how true to real life this movie ended up being, I do think it's worth taking a closer look at. That being said, in this film, we're talking about a lot of very sensitive topics, especially for the 90s. I mean, this was when Epstein was at his peak. He was at his most powerful. He was at his most prolific. And nobody in the 90s really talked about this stuff because you weren't supposed to talk about it, right? It is weird. It's taboo, this idea of a New York City elite social group where they have crazy sex parties. These business people are just like the rest of us. They're just more successful. They would never do something as heinous as that. And I say all of that not to mean that the Epsteins of the world don't still exist. I mean, I don't believe that just because one guy was caught that the whole thing just poofed into thin air. And I'm also not saying that the Epstein class doesn't still engage in those activities. I very much believe they still do. Again, I don't think that these people would just stop because Epstein died, which we're still unsure about that whole thing too. I only mention all of this to say that the 80s and 90s seemed to be Epstein's peak in power and popularity, and he proliferated through literally everything. And with this new release of these Epstein files and what was happening in the 80s and 90s, there's a lot of evidence in the files to suggest that these exact same sex cults that were depicted in Eyes Wide Shut very much existed amongst the Epstein class, and I don't think it's any mistake that the film takes place in New York City. This is where Epstein was. This is where Donald Trump was. This is where all of these people who are implicated in the files were at the time, despite the fact that they still traveled all over the world. They didn't just exist in New York. But like I said, I don't think that that's a coincidence. I also don't think it's any coincidence that Kubrick got small details right, even down to the masks that are worn during the rituals. It seems way too on the nose to think that he didn't know something when he was creating this film, especially during the 90s, especially in New York City. And look, there's even more evidence to suggest that Stanley Kubrick was referencing this very class of people in this film. Now, in more recent years, Nicole Kidman had done a couple of different interviews trying to promote Big Little Lies, and there was one interview she did in Los Angeles where she said a lot of interesting things, to say the least. There's a quote from this interview that I'm going to be breaking up because it's pretty long, and we're going to talk about each of the little sections as we go. She says, "He," meaning Kubrick, "showed me how the world works and who is really in control behind the scenes. Stanley told me the world is run by PDF files." She actually said the word. I just have to censor it because I don't know what YouTube allows me to say. But let's stop there. Already we're getting some pretty incriminating stuff. This idea that Kubrick knew back in the 80s and 90s that the world was run by PDF files, and expressing that to Nicole Kidman, the co-star of the movie, while they were making the film. I mean, can we get any more obvious than that? Clearly he knew about these things. Clearly he was inspired by them when he was creating this film. Clearly he was trying to say something. Clearly he was trying to expose someone or something. And we only know now, because of the release of the Epstein files, how correct he is, or was. It's the entire elite class, the class that engages in the trafficking of young girls and boys for their own sexual pleasure. So in the movie, it actually seems a lot more tame than what actually exists in real life. Although even in the movie, they touch on the subject of PDF files and how much more prolific and common it is than people think. And of course you wouldn't think it's common. Of course you wouldn't want to think it's common. It's disgusting. It's vile. It's depraved. It's wrong. And there's just no other way to put it. Anyways, she goes on to say, "He studied secret societies his whole life. He was fascinated by them. And he said the elite, the top secret societies, they are full of men with a certain predilection. They are tied together, sort of bonded by PDF file media." So again, we're given these ideas of secret societies, and this idea that Kubrick was very interested in them, he studied them, he looked into them, being inspired by real and true events and people. Even going as far as to say that these men are bonded together by this shared, disgusting, depraved experience. These vile desires are what keep them so close. And we see this very same thing happening in real life too. I mean, Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were best friends. Trump says himself in an interview that one of the biggest things that he and Epstein had in common was their love for young girls. It's insane just to think how open they were about it, and how none of us really knew any of the details of it, and how deep it ran. But not only are they bonded by this shared, disgusting, depraved desire, they're also bonded by the blackmail that they have on each other, because if you know that I do this, then I can't let anybody else know that, and I have to know something on you as well. They're all in this circle of blackmail, which Nicole Kidman mentions next when she says, and they all know each other's dark secrets. There's no way out for any of them. It's a lifetime bond. Even if one of them wanted to go straight and repent, so to speak, he can't. His peers will bring them down. They are in it until death, driving the world to ruin. That's kind of how Stanley explained it, but it was all very complex. I'm probably not doing it justice. So again, we're getting these things that Stanley Kubrick said back when this movie was being created that are now just known to be completely accurate. It's a death cult. They're all in this together because they can't leave. Once they've engaged with this disgusting and horrible desire, I'm not going to stop reiterating it, then the others know about it. And if the others know about it and you decide to leave and they don't trust you, then kaput. And if Jeffrey Epstein is dead, we know exactly why. We know he didn't unalive himself. We know that that didn't happen. We know that somebody probably did that to him because he knew too much. Because if you get caught, if you decide to leave, if you decide to talk, that's it for you. They can't have you doing that, which is another reason why it's possible that Mr. Kubrick is no longer here with us. He opened his mouth. He was talking too much. He was saying all of this stuff to Nicole Kidman. He was talking about all of it in this movie. And Nicole Kidman has made these kinds of comments in multiple interviews before, although the interviews are not easy to find, let me tell you. They don't seem to make news headlines all too often. Shocker, I know. The media doesn't want you to know about the Epstein class? But you know what? I did the research for you guys so that I have to be on the FBI watch list and you don't. You're welcome. So again, it has been proven to us now more than ever that this elite class, the Epstein class, the deep state, the dark money class, is one that is filled with the most evil and depraved people that are just so wealthy that they manage to run our society, whether we like it or not. We've seen how through PDF file, Elia, how grape, how unaliving are all ways that these people seek to reify their power, their financial power, how they reify their global influence as some sort of sick fantasy. Everything in Eyes Wide Shut is functionally true, and the film itself could easily be classified as a documentary in my opinion, but the only reason it's not is because I don't think they went far enough. I don't think they depicted how horrible it really is. Like I said, Eyes Wide Shut undersold it. And so yes, is the film a thriller? Absolutely, but it's just as easily a documentary as well. And on top of all of that, as we've spoken about previously with our analysis of the Purge universe, the government is allegedly no stranger to taking people out when they pose some sort of threat to them, or when they start opening their mouth a little more than they should be. We've talked about Martin Luther King Jr., we've talked about Fred Hampton, we've talked about even JFK to a degree, etc., etc., etc. And so the idea that the government or this Epstein class would be willing to take out somebody like Kubrick for speaking out a little bit too much about their demonic sex cult isn't too out of reach. At least I don't think. And we have to remember, this is a weirdly specific plot for the movie to hyperfixate on. I mean, some novella from at the time, like 70 years ago, turned and shaped into this whole new modern plot with all different kinds of things attached to it. It's weird, and nothing like that had been made at the time, and I don't really think a whole lot has been made like it since, if at all. And so people didn't like or understand this movie when it initially came out. I can't say that I would have, but watching it now with all this new information that we have is so eye-opening, and it brings about an entire new understanding to the film. Now, with any conspiracy theory, there's going to be counterpoints and people trying to debunk it. So in order to keep things fair, I would like to go over some of the counterpoints and what I think about them. The first one being that he was old. He was 70 when he died. Having a heart attack at 70 is not unheard of by any means. And I do understand that. I do think that that's a very realistic possibility that he did just die in his sleep. He was 70 years old. But I would also like to bring about the point that 70 isn't that old, and he also hadn't had any previous health problems or health complications prior to this. Particularly during the filming of the movie, not a single person noticed anything that was wrong with his health. He never talked about anything being wrong with his health. It just kind of came out of thin air. It was very sudden. It was super unexpected. So I don't think you can really confirm or deny any suspicion surrounding his death just with that one point. But another point that people make that I think is a little bit stronger is asking the question, why let the film get released at all? Why unalive him right after everything had happened, right when the film was about to be released? And again, I think this is a better criticism of the conspiracy theory. But I would also like to mention that Stanley Kubrick was Stanley Kubrick at the time. This was his final film. He had already been extremely successful. So I do think that regardless of which company he went to, however many of them denied him, I think he still would have gotten the money to make this movie, if not just fund it himself. I think regardless of what happened, unless they had unalived Stanley Kubrick before the production even started, Eyes Wide Shut was going to get made. It was going to get funded. It was going to have money behind it. So those are the two main criticisms of this conspiracy theory, and I think that they're valid ones. And at the end of the day, we don't truly know what happened. I try to be a reasonable person. I try to look at things from a bunch of different perspectives, but I also try and look at what feels likely. I try to look at all of the information. I try to take into account all of the new information that we have and how that can change our perspective on past events. So did Stanley Kubrick die for creating Eyes Wide Shut? Maybe, maybe not. But also maybe. You'll have to come up with your own opinion and let me know about it in the comments. I'd love to know what y'all think about this. Anyways, with all of that out of the way, let's get into this episode's horror highlight. Today's horror highlight is Pen Pal by Dathan Auerbach. When I tell you guys, this is one of my favorite horror novels I have ever read. It is so good. You have to read it for yourself. Now, this story actually began on r/NoSleep. It started as just one part, but people loved it so much that it ended up expanding into 6 different parts and ended up getting its very own novel, obviously. And it basically follows a man who is exploring different bits and pieces that he remembers from his childhood. There are these really haunting memories that he had growing up. He's trying to piece these memories together, and as he does so, he is slowly revealing this horrific truth about his childhood. This story, I would say, also kind of relates to today's topic, which is dark, but I'm not going to spoil it any further because I think that the reveal is best done if you know nothing about the book. But I've listened to this story 2 or 3 times now on Creepcast. Shout out Creepcast, I love them. And I've read the book now twice, and it is just so good. The ending never gets any less haunting. It is just so well written. It is so, oh my god, I cannot recommend it enough. All of the reveals are so well placed. All of the scares are so effective, and it truly is the most haunting and terrifying story that I have ever read. I've said it multiple times before, but I truly believe that Pen Pal is what Longlegs was trying to be, and it failed. You can still read the original story for free on r/NoSleep, and I do believe that Dathan Auerbach still has the story on his page as well. His account, I believe, is still 1,000 Vultures, but if I'm being honest, I highly recommend just picking up the book and supporting him that way. The novel is a lot more refined, there's a lot more detail in it, and I think that it would be a better first time or second time read if you just go ahead and pick up the novel. But yeah, that was today's horror highlight. Make sure y'all go and show some support to Dathan Auerbach and pick up some of his stuff. I know that he has a couple of other stories too. I think he has another book as well. I promise you won't regret it. But yeah, that is all I have for this episode of Scary News. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did enjoy this video, then make sure you leave a like or even consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. And make sure you go and check out the Jinx Podcast and show it some love. I'd really appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a beautiful rest of your day. Anyways, see y'all. Bye.